Hello, and welcome to the 2015 North American Systemic Constellations Conference, Conversations with our presenters. And today I have with me Alison Fornes, and she is presenting on Friday the 13th in the morning, Constellations in Teacher Professional Development and Classroom Learning. Welcome, Alison.
Thank you.
So this sounds very interesting. And I know you have an interesting story about how you started giving your work, and because you're a past teacher. So please tell us a little bit about your background and how you started this work.
Sure. You know, it's it's funny. I'm suddenly going blank. I don't know how I started. I spent several years teaching in New York City, teaching high school in New York City. And at that time, I was already weaving together threads of mindfulness practice, of systems thinking. I was a science teacher. And so I had these elements of art. I would often bring art into the classroom. So I had these elements of taking our science, our study of science, but really keep extending it out into the world as well as into our own experience. You know, all learning really comes through personal experience. And so I wanted to, at that time, as a teacher, as an educator, it was always my interest to try to make sure we're coming close, we're sort of in contact with what we're studying. And so through all those various serendipities, about a decade after I started my teaching, in fact, exactly a decade, really, I discovered through stories, the story of this stuff called constellation work. And the people who shared with me these stories, you could see their eyes light up. Something clearly had happened. One woman who shared it with me was a systems thinker. She's an organizational, she does organizational consulting and systems thinking. And she had just experienced a constellation. And so I was very intrigued by how she could pull together the systems thinking, which is something I was already doing, with this thing, this mysterious thing that was clearly lighting them up. So I came off of that experience, that little retreat that I had where I met these folks, and immediately dove into just a study. What is constellation work? And the first time, shortly after that, when I went to a workshop and I stood in the field as a representative, and again, not really knowing what's happening, I was representing a daughter. And I remember at the end, as we'd moved into what I would now call the healing movement, you know, the shift had been done, I stood up and I looked across at the man representing the father. And I was filled with so much love. And I often describe that experience as, that love experience, as unfiltered sunlight. Because, you know, usually when I look at the sun coming through the window, you see the little dust particles in it. And I think I at the time, I felt that a lot of my love was focusing mostly on the dust particles. But in this case, it was this really strong and very pure sense of love coming through me towards this complete stranger. And that ability to access that information was very intriguing to me as an educator. And just as I said, with my own motivation to ask this question, how do we really deeply understand what we're studying? And here we are stepping into a system, and I am accessing this very clear information. And it was very simple. There was nothing, I didn't know anything. I just was invited to step into the field, and through just invitation and openness, here I am connecting with information that's clearly beyond anything that I made up in my brain. So that became this little seed that stayed with me, and it grew over the course of my training. So I actually, by the spring of 2012, I stopped classroom teaching, and I dedicated myself to constellation work, to training in constellation work. And I became a skilled facilitator and able to help, guide that process of bringing people into the field and having the same experience and creating really powerful healing movement. But what's happened now is that I've come back to this education question, because for me, part of what's driving me is that, when we first talking about constellation work, oftentimes we don't really, it's hard to come up with the right language. And I know that, in fact, we've talked about this. It's one of the questions that we ask is, well, how do you describe constellation work to a stranger? And the language feels like, you find ways to start to pull together a language, but I know for me, it always gives me pause. What do I do? But I think the reason it gives us pause is because we've been living in a paradigm where everything we've been taught for many years, and maybe for hundreds of years, arguably, that this is where things, we've created this shift where this is where things exist. This is the seat and the center through which all information comes. We work, we crank out information with our brains. But of course, our ancestors know, and probably even not even that many generations back, that information comes to us in all sorts of ways, including through our body, through a direct experience in our body. And so for me, part of what's happening is my motivation to bring the work into education is really to help bring us back to very old ways of knowing that are indigenous, that are native to our human bodies. So this has become a lot of what I am, I'm doing in education. I'll give you a very simple example of how I use it. About a year ago, my daughter and I were about to go to a children's play. We'd been invited to go to a children's play about Sacagawea. And Sacagawea led the Lewis and Clark Expedition West. And so I really didn't know much about her other than what I just said. And her image on the coin, we have a $1 coin here that has the image of Sacagawea and her son on her back. And so I decided, well, let's play with this a little bit. Let's do a sort of constellation, a little inquiry. I call my work body-centered inquiry. So we set up some spaces on the floor. One place represented Lewis, and one represented Clark, and one represented Sacagawea. And we stood in each of those spaces. And when I stood with Sacagawea, I was struck by an experience of grief. And that feeling in my body became the lens looked into her story, because we wanted to know, well, why would she be feeling grief? And if you go into her story, it often begins with one pivotal moment in her life, which kidnapped by a rival tribe. And in the culture of their time, we use the language kidnapping. I don't know if that's exactly the right fit, but she was taken and basically raised, adopted into this new tribe. That taking away was this, set this experience of grief, set this tone for her that actually comes up again in the course of her, even in the course of the Lewis and Clark expedition, because as they're traveling west, one of the things that happens is she finds her way back to her original tribe. They have a reunion, and the expedition spends a couple nights with her people before they continue on. And so there is this incredible motivation that it's very easy to overlook, and unless you can step into the field in that way. And so it's like any experience of creativity where it allows you to sort of step out of this space and really into a much bigger space. And so that's what we're doing. I really, just as we experience constellation work with so much joy, it's so much fun. It's very rich, of course, the experience to go into those places of trauma, to go into that place of not knowing, and then to find these subtle shifts that create movement. But it's such an engaging process. Anyone who has the experience of it wants to come back into it. And the idea for me that we can create classrooms that are like that a person can look at really any issue and say, you know, my other area of interest is in justice, social justice issues. And so I have a conference coming up in a couple of weeks where we're going to look at some of these things. And one of the things we look at, for example, we're very curious about is the school to prison pipeline for Black men in particular in this country. And you know, that is a very complex system. And for me, the ability to inquire into complex systems is in a way that goes beyond just me trying to crank things out up here, but using an inquiry that starts here. That's what we're getting at, because I think when we can do that, it opens up so much more to us. Yeah, so that's what I'm introducing. That's my motivation.
Awesome. Boy, that's very informative. I loved that. Mm-hmm. So, leading that now to your talk. I don't know if you can add anything, Alison. That was just so good.
Yeah. Well, you know, the talk is going to be very specifically about the process that I'm using. And I start to go into the New York City schools this week. So I'm a vendor for the New York City Department of Education. So I can provide professional development. So I have a school that I'm working with. And my interest, you know, we have to, just like when we're doing a constellation in any setting, my interest is making sure that I'm aligning what I can provide with the needs of, you know, the educators in the school. So I have a process for listening to folks, and then for teaching allowing them to move into a body-centered inquiry experience. The main barrier, if there's a barrier at all, you know, the main barrier is really just a person's trust in the process, belief. You know, when I work in organizations, I certainly have had the experience where many folks are open, but some folks are like, they just don't get it. There's a sense of, I just don't get it. What are you doing? Why, you know, I don't understand anything you're saying. I don't understand what they're saying, you know, when they're representing. I don't get it, you know.
I don't want to get it.
And I don't want to get it, you know. So, you know, I have some awareness that as I move into a different setting, you know, when you're working in a healing setting and people are coming to me, clearly they want what I have to offer. They want that healing, that experience of constellations. They're really open to it. That you get a group of folks who can move into the field with greater ease, even as they're having questions about it. But when you're coming into a different environment, we change the language. That's why I call it body center. I constellate, so I do use the verb, but I don't talk so much about constellations. And I stay inside of this inquiry process because I want to emphasize that we get to move back and forth between a kind of body-centered knowing, an embodied knowing, and a little bit of, you know, we step out and then just play with it with our minds, you know. And I think that kind of play puts people at ease. And then as you build that up, that muscle, you know, that comes in trusting their body to know information, that gets stronger, and they feel that they can trust and rely on it. And my sense is that I've talked to the school that I'm working with is that what I'm most interested in is building a critical mass, that not every educator, not every teacher in the school needs to be on board, but that there are teachers who can hold it, who really trust the process, and who can help really create a container for the rest of the school. And I think my secret belief is that even for those who have this question of trust, that they're, you know, I think part of what we're looking for when we're having that question about, can I trust this process? Can I trust what my body is telling me? Is that they really want to be reassured that yes, they can, because it's a deep sense of that I actually have a knowledge within, that I don't have to find information outside, and that's the only way I can get it. So, there's that expression, knowledge is power. And when I first started thinking about body-centered inquiry, using it in this classroom setting, for me, it felt like a revolution, because it really felt like what we're doing is we're very clearly locating our access to knowledge here, inside of this being, as opposed to external. So I need some other person or some other teacher or some other book, to give me information. Of course, I completely want a relationship with those things. I'm not suggesting that we only use one source of information, but that I can play with getting back into a kind of access of information that comes through here. That's I think a real gift.
Wow, that is so exciting. We got to record your talk. Okay, yeah, that's because I do organizational, and I'm along the same lines as how do you get people to recognize that felt sense is valid, and that our lives and our businesses are not all linear, pragmatic relationships. Yeah. Oh my gosh, Alison, that was super. I didn't stop you, but we're about time now. And so we won't ask you the next question because you are full of information.
That's right, of course. Come to the workshop. Isn't that what this is about?
That's all it's about. Yeah.
You can find me. I blog at expandedknowing.com. And that's where I'm writing a lot about what I'm doing in an educational setting. There's a lot of just how does Alison, how am I thinking about things is filtered through that blog. So if folks are interested in the work, that's a good place to start.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time today. So I just want to mention again, Alison's talk is Friday morning, November 13th at Constellations in Teacher Professional Development and Classroom Learning, and maybe even little organizational ideas about how to get your teams
That's right.
involved in constellating. Love it. Thank you very much, Alison. I really appreciate your time.
You're so welcome. Thanks, Linda.
Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.